Today we'll continue with the plants. Last time we talked about the overall plants. We covered all of the non-vascular plants, relatively small, the liverwort and mosses, and we discussed the part of the reproduction. Water is needed for the fertilization, the life cycle. Always remember the alternation of generations. The diploid one produces spores. Well, diploid one produces spores. Spores are always haploid, and the spores will produce haploid, or gametophyte generation will produce gametes. So it will go over and over again in all of the plants. All of the plants have that particular thing. However, now we start talking about the next group, the more advanced group of the plants known as the trichiophytes. It's not the official group. Tracheos means what? Tube. Phytos means plants. Plant with the tubes, known as the vascular plants. And I already told you before that vascular system is nothing else but the system of tubes for the transport. So see right there, transport is extremely important. Same thing as us. Many of the animals have some sort of cardiovascular system, right? Exactly in the same idea, to transport the nutrients, the oxygen from the lungs getting through all of the cells or living cells of your body. The carbon dioxide will be collected and removed from there. So now, whenever we start talking about the vascular tissues, we start seeing the actual organs, the true organs, the true roots. Remember, before we were talking about the rhizoid, root-like structures, but in this particular case, it's a true roots, true stems, not a stipe no more, and actual true leaves, not blades. So, and again, each one of them will have its own functions, and we'll discuss that later on next week. So again, vascular system is extremely important for the transport. What exactly is being transported? That's a very important part. Remember again, the photosynthesis, a very simple reaction of photosynthesis, which I'm asking you to memorize. 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters, right? In the presence of sunlight. So light is essential for that. So now, where are the carbon dioxide coming from? From the air. Where are the water coming from? From the ground, generally speaking. So to take that water from the ground and send it up the stem, this is what the vascular system does. And remember, plants don't have we have a beating heart. They don't have a beating heart. They're using a very different ideas, strategies to achieve the same thing. They don't have muscles. Our heart or hearts, and some of the animals, they have more than one heart. They beating, they contracting, they sending the blood in a particular direction. In this case, plant needs to take the water out of the ground and send it sometimes literally hundreds of feet up without a single muscle cell. So now what happened there? Why it's going up? Because there is leaves, right? Leaves are generally used for the photosynthesis, the process taking place. So 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters plus light will give us what? Something sweet. Glucose, C6H12O6. And that glucose, the food for the rest of the body of the plant, needs to be transported now down all the way to the roots, because roots require some food. Well, the living cells of the roots require food, and the leaves are producing. So leaves are producing, now it needs to transport it back downwards. And this is why they will have 2 different types of the tissues. We'll talk about the xylem and phloem. Xylem generally transporting chemicals upward, water with the dissolved minerals, and phloem, dissolved sugar, transporting it downwards. But we'll talk about that later. But again, in this particular case, transport is important, but it's based or tied up to the photosynthesis. And then, of course, it's 6 oxygens will be produced during that particular reaction, and the oxygen will be released into the atmosphere. All right. So now let's kind of take a look. Here, what we have, a very important part, something which known as the seedless. Seedless, they do not produce seeds, and today we'll talk about that, what the seed is. But essentially, seed is the embryo of the plant with the food source. Those ones do not produce the that particular thing. They still reproducing with help of spores or spreading out. And in this case, we have basically 2 major groups and the ferns, right? So that's basically it. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and today's lab will be about this particular group today, seedless, but now vascular plants. As soon as we start seeing the vascular system arriving at the plant kingdom, we start seeing that they increase in sizes. They start growing tall, they start growing big, because now they can transport, they can get closer to the sun, they can outrun the competition. However, for those ones, the water is still important for reproduction. These guys come up with their own ideas on how to get the sperm to the egg without the water. And we'll talk about why exactly they had to do that. But at some point of time, seedless vascular plants, ferns, and such were growing really tall. We're talking about trees, the whole forests were made out of the ferns. As a matter of fact, during that particular time, roughly 300 or so millions of years ago, the climate was relatively wet. Think about, well, Southeast Houston, Southeast Texas, or Louisiana type of the climate. Almost all of the, on almost all of the continents. Most of the continents were kind of close to equator. As a result, it was very humid, very wet environment. So those particular trees were growing, and then they were falling down whenever they died, falling down, get buried. And over a period of time, 250 or so millions of years later, now we're digging out those mass grave of those particular plants, and we are burning them. We know that as the coal deposits, okay? I already told you that we are horrible to the plants overall. We are really, really bad. We're eating all kinds of weird things from the plants without even thinking about it. Let me kind of give you an example. It sounds like almost out of, I don't know, which book in the Middle Ages. In order to prepare the extract, you need to get fresh embryos. Those particular embryos initially need to be skinned and roasted. After roasting them, it needs to be grinded, and the hot dihydrogen monoxide needs to be put, poured over those particular grinded, roasted embryos. Later on, the extract from those roasted embryos should be poured in a cup. Some of the overnutritious bovine sweat can be added for taste, and also some of the extract from the plants can be added to enhance the taste. And you can enjoy it, or you can enjoy it plain. What I just described, coffee. Coffee is extract from the plant, well, from the seeds, right? The coffee beans. Coffee beans needs to be roasted. Well, seeds are basically the embryos and the food source for the embryo. This is what we are, well, what I'm drinking right now. Embryo extract with the cow sweat. I mean milk, but we know that the milk glands basically originated from the sweat glands. So it's overnutritious sweat. The milk next time when you will be drinking, right? Yeah, milk, nice sweat. Yes, or think about it. Do you like chocolate? Think about what chocolates are, or chocolate. Again, you're starting with the cacao fruits, which is overgrown ovaries. Within that, there is the embryos. Embryos needs to be a fermented. So rotten embryos of cacao plant later on needs to be dried up. Again, needs to be roasted a little bit. Then it needs to be grinded up. Added some sugar, which is extract from the plant stems, right? Sugar cane. And well, formed it and send it to the people who likes chocolate. Yay. Yeah, rotten embryos right there. Oh, think about it. The strawberries dipped in chocolate. We already talked about chocolate as a rotten embryos. Now, what the strawberry is? Essentially, strawberry as the fruit is overgrowing ovary of the plant with the tiny little bitty seed, right? And the seeds we already established are embryos. So we're eating ovary with embryos. Yummy, right? All right. So anyway, we're horrible to the plants and they cannot outrun, so we're eating all kinds of parts. So now seeds. Again, we'll talk about the seeds and there will be a gymnosperms, naked seeded. Gymnos means naked, sperm means seed. And then angiosperms, covered seeded. What they covered with? They covered by the fruit. That's important and we'll discuss that. But please make sure that it's not just the seed cover, it's a fruit. Because each seed will consist of three major parts: the cover, the food source, and the embryo. Cover is protecting embryo from drying out. So anyway, so vascular plants will have two tissues, vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. We'll talk about the structures of those tissues a little bit later, but xylem generally conducts water and minerals upwards. Phloem conduct dissolved sugars. And again, it's based on the photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide from the air combines with the water in the presence of light will create sugar. So now sugar needs to be transported. So once again, process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration is extremely important. That's the reason why I'm asking you to memorize those particular reactions. And I have no problem to give points, extra points, bonus points whenever I will ask you that particular question. That reactions will be almost on every single test. If you don't remember it, if you haven't memorized it, you can talk to me during the lab, shoot me a quick message, and I will type it in again. I already typed it in once in the lab. That's exactly what I'm looking for. But if you forgot, you don't really remember where it was, bacterial lab, so lab number 3, I believe. But in this particular case, make sure that you know those reactions. You will see that again and again and again. So ferns, horsetails, and club mosses. Don't get that particular name mixing you up. It looks like a moss, but it's actual vascular plants. Remember, the true mosses are non-vascular. So what you're looking at right is those particular ferns. You've probably seen the ferns. We're quite often using it as a house plant. And then of course you'll see the flowers, that's angiosperms, and any kind of coniferous would be a gymnosperms. So they can grow tall. Why? Because they have a conductive system. It's essentially, think about it as the highways of transporting. Better the highway, faster the things can be delivered. Faster the things can be delivered, taller the tree can be. I have vascular system, we already discussed that. So in this case, this is the structures, or this is the plants we'll talk about today, including the lab. This particular creature right there, whisk fern, very, very interesting, extremely interesting. As you can see, it looks like just the stems, dichotomous, breaking apart by twos, right? Kind of doubling. And then on top, they have a yellow structures right there. No leaves, no nothing. It resembles, as far as we understand, resembles one of the very first plants, and we talked about that last time, known as the Cooksonia. We think that the initial plants were, well, the first terrestrial plants were looking very similar to that. That one is already have a vascular system, etc. So it's very advanced comparatively to the Cooksonia, etc. But Cooksonia was smaller, short, similarly looking structures, similarly looking plants. So they had the stems for the photosynthesis, and then yellow things are known as the sporangia. This is where the spores will be produced. And then, of course, we'll talk about the homosporous and heterosporous plants today, and you will see it in the lab as well. And then, of course, we have something which is known as the ferns, and most of you seen ferns right here. And then there is a horse tails. I guess it looks like a horse, and they have a very interesting structure. We'll discuss that in the lab as well. So here we're looking at the fern. This particular one, the single leaf of the fern known as the frond. It's kind of compound, complex leaf. This one is probably some sort of, this one for sure is the angiosperm, but this is the frond, so to speak, of fern frond. As you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 fronds growing out of literally rock, and you can see the also you can see the lichens, right? Different color structures, the crusty ones, the leafy ones, and so on. So they can grow pretty much almost anywhere, and they have an underground stem known as a rhizome. Rhizome, root-like. Don't forget, or don't mix it up. Rhizoid, root-alike, and rhizome, stem, which look like a root. One of the great examples, and next time whenever you will be in the grocery stores, you can go to fresh produce and find something which is known as the ginger, a fresh ginger. Fresh ginger, even though ginger is the flowering plant, that particular, and most likely in the grocery store, it will say root of ginger, which is incorrect. It's technically a rhizome, root-like stem. Whatever we're consuming, we're not consuming the roots, we're consuming stems. But they are underground, so that particular underground stems known as the rhizomes. So yes, and leaves already, we'll talk about that, they're called ferns. So here's, again, we're looking at the alternation of generations. So here what we're looking at the adult mature sporophyte, so diploid structure. That particular one is the underground stem, rhizome. This is the actual roots, and now we have a fronds coming out. The young fronds known as the fiddlehead, because they underground, they kind of combined. Whenever they're coming from the underground, they open up, but whenever they tied it up, it looks like a fiddlehead. Fiddle, basically the musical instrument, right? So in this particular case, the fiddleheads then later on opens up, and then we have the frond. On the front, on the back side of the front, there is a clusters of sporangiums. Those particular clusters known as the sorus, a single cluster, sori plural. So within the sorus, we'll have a sporangium. In sporangium, the meiosis taking place, producing myospores. So meiosis will take from a diploid. Now the spores are haploid. Sexual reproduction, right? Kinda. Because in this particular case, the spores would be genetically different from each other since they produced by the process of meiosis. Now, spore have to get into a comfortable environment, and then it will start growing into a protonema, and then eventually it will get into a complete or mature gametophyte. Tiny little bitty structure, a speck of green, literally. Can it be seen with the naked eye? Yes, but you have to literally look it up. It's tiny. But in this particular case, it's green, meaning it's photosynthesizing. That one is also green, meaning it's photosynthesizing. So both of them, or neither of them, are parasite on another. Both of them are free living organisms. So on the gametophyte, in the central part, we'll find the archegonium, the structures containing the eggs. And then on the side of that, quite often we'll find the antheridium containing tons of sperm. sperm require water to swim into the from the antheridium into the archegonium. Can they do self fertilization? Technically, yes, prefer not to do that in order to increase the increase the genetic variance. So let's say we have one gametophyte, and that particular gametophyte, as you can see, it has kind of a heart-shaped structure, so it's known as the Irish heart or heart. We'll talk about that because it kind of looks Irish Valentine, quite often referred, because it looks like a heart, but Irish is the, the green color is the color of the Ireland. If you ever been in Ireland, you know why they're saying the green is the color, because whenever it's bright day, we're talking about the sunny, quite often it's gloomy, but whenever it's a bright sunny day, the colors of green is unbelievably bright. I mean, it's bright green. I probably haven't seen, well, I've seen the very similar green in Oregon, well, East or West Coast, like Northwest Coast, or Oregon and Washington State. They have a green, similar green during the sunny days. Anyway, so in this particular case, this is the gametophyte producing gametes, fertilization occurs, and we start seeing that the zygote, now it's a diploid organism, and out of the zygote, we'll start seeing the new sporophyte growing, also green, so it's not really parasitizing on its gametophyte. So in this particular case, the new sporophyte eventually will grow into a mature sporophyte, and the whole cycle continues. That's a very simplistically saying, without going too much in the details of the fern life cycle. But again, alternation of generation happens, but now you can see that the haploid gametophyte generations, it's reduced in size, right? While the sporophyte generation is much larger in size. As a matter of fact, whenever you start looking at the vascular plants, if you see it with your naked eye, most likely looking at the sporophyte, gametophyte drastically reducing in size, and in the flowering plants, they literally a handful of cells. So you have to have a microscope for that. So which is conspicuous? Conspicuous, the one which you can easily see, that would be a sporophyte comparatively to non-vascular plants where we had the gametophyte. So conspicuous, that one you can see. Can you see this one? Once again, yes, but you will have to look for it. Generally, well, again, in Oregon, a couple of years ago, I went into, well, we were in the forest, and I kind of start looking for ferns, and I found it, but it's tiny little bitty one. You have to look for usually using a magnifying glass, etc. So which one is inconspicuous? Generally, the mature gametophyte will be inconspicuous. Which one is the free living? Both of them. Which one's a parasite? Neither of them. Which one is photosynthetic? Well, both of them. Which one is a haploid? The gametophyte is haploid, and diploid would be the sporophyte or diploid. So exactly the same thing. We're talking about the leaf, the stem, right, root, so underground stem known as the rhizome. On the fronts, we'll see the cluster of sporangias. Within the sporangia, meiosis taking place, producing the genetically different spores, spores getting into the comfortable condition, germinates, growing into the Irish Valentine, producing archegonium and antheridium. Fertilization occurs, but again, have to have water. That's why the ferns will not be found in the very dry places. And that's one of the reasons why later on we start seeing the gymnosperms start taking over the world, because in 250 or so millions of years ago, the continents merged into a supercontinent, and the central part were fairly dry. So they could not get the sperm to swim through the water. As a result, they had to change the strategy on how the sperm gets to the egg. So yeah, once again, all of that zygote develops, And again, both of them are green, both of them photosynthetic, and so on. So you can read that. So comparatively to the bryophytes, sporophytes of seedless vascular plants are much larger. They become conspicuous, and they do not parasitize per se on the gametophyte. Gametophyte become tiny, and this is one of the trends where you will see in the plants. The gametophyte generally reduces in size, and in the gymnosperms as well as the angiosperms, naked seeded, and the flowering plants, you will see that actual gametophyte now completely depending, parasitizing on the sporophyte. So 180 degrees turn from the use of gametophyte and sporophyte. So you're looking at this particular picture, and this is the ferns right here. Can you see the gametophytes, the Irish valentines? No, I cannot see them. But most likely somewhere here you will find them. If you get once again on your knees with the magnifying glass, you most likely will be able to find some of the gametophytes somewhere around here. Most of the ferns nowadays stayed as the bushes, kinda, even though there is some which is considered to be still tree ferns. Again, about 250, 300 millions of years ago, we had the whole forests of the ferns and horsetails. Not any longer, but some of the tree ferns you can still find in the tropical areas. My first time I went to Hawaii, we are arriving at the northern island known as Kauai. Beautiful island, probably my favorite, not probably, this is my favorite island out of them all. But in this particular case, we're coming out of the airport, and then there is right there on the street, literally on the street, there is a tree fern, and I'm talking to my wife like, look, honey, there is a tree fern, and she is the engineering slash math professor, and she's like, well, who cares about that? I'm like, no, it's a tree-like fern. She's like, okay, so big whoop. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's exotic, it's like living fossil. She's like, okay, whatever you say. So anyway, so once again, we're looking at those particular ferns, and this is the fronds, right? We talk about the fronds, and fronds are important. Which generation in the fern is the parasite? Neither, because both of them are photosynthetic. So here what we're looking at, it's a tiny little bitty fern, and you can already see the underground stem, the rhizome, the fronds coming out, and then of course over a period of time it will grow and will become much larger. Water is still needed. Fertilization cannot happen without the water. Yes, and meiosis will produce the spores, and spores are haploid, single set of the chromosomes to grow into the gametophyte. So some of the vocabularies, we already talked about the prothallus, right? Thallus from the we talk about the thallus as the body of the marchantia, as well as the hornworts, so liverworts and hornworts. So same kind of idea. Fern gametophyte, especially when it starts growing as the in the beginning, whenever the spore just start to divide, to develop into a gametophyte, the Irish valentine. If you'll use the word prothallus for the Irish valentine, I'll be okay with it. No, rhizomes are horizontal, more or less underground stem. It's a true stem. Rhizoid, root-like structures, right? In mosses and liverworts. Frond, large leaves. Sometimes fronds will be referred to the palm leaves as well, a frond of the palm. I had three palms in my backyard. Unfortunately, during the freeze, two of them died right away. One of them was kind of start sending the fronds again. So I was thinking it survived, but then during this summer it died. Yeah, unfortunately. Anyway, Antheridium, we already talked about the sperm-producing structures in moss and the ferns, and the Archegonium, remember, egg inside, so egg-producing structures in moss and ferns. All right, so here we're looking at the fronds. Sori, which is sorus, plural. Rhizomes, root stems, leaves, basically it's all combined together into a fern. So this is the front, right? If you look on the back side of that, you will see those particular fuzzy things. Those fuzzy things are nothing else but the clusters of sporangia. One of those little dots would be a sporangium containing tons of spores. Again, they're producing a lot and a lot of spores. Why? To overcome the difficulties that the spore will have to get to be transported by the wind and have to end up in a comfortable conditions environment to start growing into a protallus and then gametophyte, all that particular stuff. So to overcome that, they're producing tons of spores. Yeah, Sora is a cluster of sporangia. Here we have another cluster of sporangium. All of them, each one of them is a cluster, right? Everybody understood that. It's not a single sporangium, it's a bunch of them. In this case, so one sorus, two sorus, well, sori now, and so on. What is inside of the brown dots? Spores, myospores, haploid spores produced by the meiosis. So this is what we essentially will see in the lab, not as big of magnification, but that's a single sporangium opens up, releasing haploid spores. This one is a not mature sporangium yet, but you can see spores are packed inside. So phylum Pteridophyta, horsetails. Those ones, again, about 200 millions of years ago, 250 millions of years ago, were growing tall. We're talking about 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 feet tall forests. Nowadays, they are generally stay within the 5 feet tall, relatively thin. What's really important, they have those particular very interesting arrangement of leaves. Later on, we'll talk about the leaves arrangement, the alternative, the opposite, and then something which known as a whorl. What exactly it is? We're looking at the stem, right? And at the particular place on the stem known as the node, we'll see the leaves. Those particular things coming out, there are leaves. So those leaves coming out, and if there is a more than two leaves coming out from the node, it's known as a whorl of leaves. And you can see that those particular stems have ridges. You can clearly see those ridges right here, and those ridges to make that particular stem more stronger, because inside of those particular stems, well, stems are empty. They don't have anything inside. Similar to bamboo, but that's not a bamboo at all. I mean, the bamboo is actually a flowering plant, believe it or not. So in this particular case, horsetails, small, about 5 feet tall tops. And again, they are quite commonly found near the rivers and the bogs and the swamps and the creeks, etc. We have them around here, you might see them. So they grow about 5 feet tall. I went to Alaska, and then Alaska in the forest, you can find them growing about 3-4 feet tall, about my height, but very thin. Need to find those pictures. So wet marshy places, stems are hollow, and they contain silica. We already talked about silica when we talk about some of the algae, right? Remember, diatoms were making silica, the shells, the clear shells out of silica. In this particular case, stems are using, well, horsetails using to embed silica in the stems for two reasons. A, to reinforce the stems. Remember, stems are hollow. B, those tiny little bitty pieces of silica, which we already know as the glass, essentially glass made out of silica, SiO2, will make them less eatable by the any kind of herbivores. For example, if you send a cow munching on the grass, it will happily munch on the grass, and then it will not touch the horsetails. Why not? Because eating too much horsetails in the diet, it will start upsetting and literally cutting minute cuts like tons of tiny little bitty paper cuts in the stomach, and eventually it might lead into a heavy bleeding, and essentially the animal can die. If it just chew on one stem, not a big deal, but in many cases, in some cases, it might lead to the death of the animal. So that's one. As a result, pioneers were used to scrub pots and pans, and also because of the silica, in some cultures, they were using the horsetails ferns or stems for polishing, fine polishing, like of the swords, etc. So here's what we're looking at. And again, you can see those stems, right? And this is the nodes. Those ones that don't really have much of the leaves. The stems are doing the photosynthesis. Now, on top of the stem right here, what do we have? A cluster of the sporangium. Sporangia, right? So cluster, that particular cluster known as the strobili or strobilus, in single one strobilus, plural strobili. Okay, and again, it takes the spores are high in the air to spread it as far as possible, especially to being picked up by the wind. Now, lycophyta, known as the club mosses, because if you look at this, at the plant itself, it looks very similar to the mosses, hence the name mosses. And they have those particular clubs looking structures, which is a strobili, spore producing structures, spore bearing structures on top, strobili. But later on, when the botanists start looking at the anatomy, they figured it out that it's actually not a moss, but it's the vascular plant. And this is how they look like. It looks very similar to the mosses, but again, on top, they have those strobili to send these spores into the wild, so to speak. Relatively short, about 10 inches tall tops, woodlands, any kind of, they do have a vascular tissue, so that they're not bryophytes. They belong to the different group. So make sure you understand that. And then importance. Help to form soil. Whenever they die, they form a soil. That's for the environment, right? Hold soil in place to prevent erosion. We already discussed that the ferns can live pretty much anywhere or almost anywhere. They don't really require much of the soil. So again, another importance in the for the environment. Now we're using them as the house plants, and also remember I told you what the humans doing to pretty much everything: food and medicine. Food, medicine, food, medicine. So right now we're using some of the ferns for the medicinal purpose. Some of the horsetails can be used for the medicinal purposes as well. And we are eating ferns. Southeast Asia, I should say East Asia, not necessarily South, like Japan, Korea, China, and down. They have quite a few dishes with the ferns in, like a salads with the fern. Well, the sauteed fern with the meat tastes really, really good. I tried that before. I really like that. Korean cuisine, I overall like it. So if you ever tried it, good for you. If not, I would recommend you to try. And in the lab, I was quite surprised that here in the southeast part of United States, we are actually pickling the fiddleheads. You will see a jar in the lab. Some of them can be cooked and eaten, like I said. And remember, they formed coal. Mass graves, mass produced, the forest, which died off about 200 millions of years ago, got buried, changed into the coal. Now we're digging them out, taking that carbon, which has been in the ground, taking out of the carbon cycle for quite some time, and we are burning it in order to produce energy, right? But at the same time, we are increasing the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere quite fast. And that this is where the whole global warming coming from and so on, because yes, carbon dioxide is the gas, greenhouse gas, and yes, we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But on another hand, remember the photosynthesis, right? Carbon dioxide is essential, it's essentially part of the food for the plants. They have to take carbon dioxide and embed it with the water, combining it into the sugars. So no carbon dioxide, plants will start dying off, literally. So we increasing the amount. However, we're also increasing the temperature on the surface because we are at the same time, we're killing quite a few plants. We are cutting down the forests and so on. So in this particular case, we are on one hand increasing the carbon dioxide, on another hand, we are decreasing the amount of plants which can consume that extra carbon dioxide. And of course, all of the pollution in the ocean also reduces the rates of the photosynthesis. So this is kind of sad. So this one will stop momentarily. Let me pull it out another. Here we go. Let me really quickly go and pull out another. PowerPoint. Here we go. So that was about the seedless non-vascular and then vascular plants. Now we start talking about the seeded plants. And as you can see from this particular cladogram, we have quite a few groups. And out of those particular quite a few groups, well, you can see some of those. We'll talk a little bit in the lab about some of those extinct plants, but generally we'll talk about the cycads, we'll talk about the ginkgos, and we'll talk about the conifers. There is another group known as the gnetophytes, and we'll not, well, right here, we'll talk a little bit today because they are very close. As you can see, they're on the same kind of spiral, on the same branch with the flowering plants. And next time we'll continue with the flowering plants. So today we'll talk about the conifers or something which known as the gymnosperms, not necessarily conifers, but that's the largest group out of the gymnosperms. So here what we're looking at. Remember, before that, we have a vascular system. We had mosses, we had the horsetails and the ferns. And then something happened. What exactly happened? The continents start moving together into a Pangea, a huge territorial landmass, and the central part were really, really dry. Because it was really, really dry, and remember, mosses as well as the ferns require water for reproduction. Second of all, spores have to get into a relatively wet environment to start growing into the prothallus. In this particular case, that was not available. The spore will get in a dry area, will die off. As a result, they had to change the whole idea how to spread. And this is where the seed evolved. Seed is the embryo which is already developed or start developing with the food source and the cover to protect it from dehydration or desiccation, drying out. Okay, and now they also had the problem with how to get the sperm to the egg without the water. And they come up with the idea, animals during that particular time were facing exactly the same problem. Before that, there was the age of amphibians. Remember, amphibians, frogs, etc., have to get back to water in order to lay eggs. In this case, lots of water was not available. Yes, around the coastline of that particular huge continent, there was plenty of water, everything was going good. But the central part had this issue. There is no water. How exactly we'll get it? Internal fertilization for animals. Plants cannot move. They cannot find the female plant or male plant, whatever, So they had to come up with the idea to send the sperm literally through the air. And they come up with another advantage for the plants known as the pollen. Pollen, essentially, pollen grains is essentially nothing but the sperm of the plant. So next time, whenever the weatherman or woman will say, today we have a high pollen count. Well, not today because we have rain, but if today is a high pollen count, essentially what she's saying, there is a high level of the plant sperm in the air. Anyway, so evolution of the seed is extremely important from the perspective of withstanding or living on a dry land. And later on, we'll end up with the evolution of flowering plants and what they come up with, flowers, and also the cover for the seed. What kind of cover? The fruit. Remember, any kind of seed, and the naked seeded as well, will be made out of three major parts: the embryo, the food source, and the cover to protect the embryo from drying out. They already have, so it's kind of misleading a little bit. But what coniferous or gymnosperms lack is the fruit. The seeds are not within the fruits. That's why they call naked seeded. Anyway, so seeds are primary means of reproduction as well as the dispersal, so no more spores. And we have two relatively large groups. Seeds are reproductively superior. Why? Because now we don't have a cell, we have the whole embryo, which is developed further down. It has the abundant food supply. And we, as the consumers, quite often going, whenever if you ate any kind of nuts, if you hazelnuts, if you like peanuts, pecans, or anything like that, this is essentially what we are eating. We're eating the embryo, and we're not going for the embryo per se, but we're going for the food supply of the embryo. If you ever tried beans before, right? And living in South Houston, well, South Texas, it's kind of impossible not to have beans. So all of those are food supply which plant produced for the embryo, and we're saying, well, we need it better. We will eat your embryo as well as the food supply of the embryo. And again, once again, look like this, look here. Each seed has a protective coat. Doesn't really matter if it's a naked seeded or angiosperm covered seeded plants, it has the protective seed. The main difference between the gymnosperms and angiosperms is that the seeds of the gymnosperms is not enclosed in the fruits. Even though there is some plants which even within the gymnosperms which start looking very similar to the seeds or berries or anything like that. So they evolved about 400 millions of years ago, and then about 250 millions of years ago, gymnosperms become the dominant producers. Why? Climate change. A huge continent combined together, now a huge dry areas. Huge dry areas, this is where gymnosperms had the upper hand comparatively to the ferns. No more water is needed for reproduction. And now we're looking at the embryo is more equipped to survive under the harsh environments. So we continue to see the reduction of the gametophytes. Now they're becoming a handful of cells. Heterospory, we talked about that last time. What is the heterospory? Once again, let me kind of show it to you. Let's see. If you have a plant and within the plant, and today you'll see it in the lab, but you will see that the spores are looking about the same size. You cannot tell that that particular spore will produce a male plant or male gametophyte. That one will produce female gametophyte. So that one is the Homo sporus. The ferns, some of the ferns, especially the club mosses, will have, some of them will be a homosporus, meaning the spores are about the same size. Now, later on, we start seeing the heterospority. Now you're looking at this. You can clearly see some of the spores are much larger than the others. The larger spores will become a female gametophyte, and the smaller one will become male gametophyte. Now you can, just looking at them, you can see the difference in sizes. This is what heterosporosity is. Make sure you understand that. It will be on the upcoming Bio 2 test. On the test 2, there will be a question regarding, I'm paraphrasing, but it will be something like along the line. Briefly describe the difference between heterosporosity and homosporosity, or explain the terms heterosporous and homosporous. Nothing really to do with who likes whom. For some other reason, students going into homo and heterosexuality. Whatever your preferences are, this is not it. Heterosporosity is the difference in the spores. If the spores are all the same, they're homosporous, about the same size. If they are different in sizes, you have a large one, the megaspore, and the small one is microspore. That's a heterosporous plant. All right? Please remember that. Now we start looking at the ovules. This is where the egg will be produced. And the pollen, we already talked about that it's essentially is the sperm or several sperms within the protective capsule. So again, remember, the sporophyte was initially in the non-vascular seedless plants. The sporophyte was a parasite, minuscule part of the life of the gametophyte. Gametophyte was predominant. Then we moved to the ferns. Now gametophyte and sporophytes, both of them are free living, but the gametophyte is drastically reduced in sizes. All right. Now we're looking at the microscopic gametophytes, which will be found inside of the sporophyte. So whenever you're looking at any kind of tree, that's a sporophyte. The question is if it's a flowering plant or the naked seeded plant, fern, for example, or cypresses, or anything like that. But oak tree will be a flowering plant. So now we're looking at the microscopic gametophytes. The gametophyte, male gametophyte in the flowering plants, literally 2 cells. 2. 3. Fine, 3. Well, initially 2, and one of them is split into 2 sperms, and then there will be a tube something, tube cells, which will create the tube, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The female gametophyte is essentially 8 cells. All right, so very, very small, from the full organism into a handful of cells. So this is one of the very important trends in the plant evolution. So gymnosperms also tracheophytes. Tracheophytes means vascular plants, and you're looking at the gymnosperm right here, a pine tree. That's one of the most common one. Now, gymnosperm is naked seeded. Anybody of you tried pine nuts? Pine nuts is the actual nuts from the pine tree, a very specific type of the pine tree, but any kind of pine nut will have a cover, even though it says naked. It's naked because it does not have, whenever you're breaking the pine cone and taking it out, does not have the fruit. No fruits means naked, but it has a seed, and any kind of seed will have 3 major parts. The embryo right here, that the kind of light bluish, tealish color. Then purplish bluish is the food source, and the outer part is the protective cover. It's protecting the embryo from drying out. Make sure you understand that. There will be a question, compare, contrast gymnosperms and angiosperms. The main difference is flowers. Gymnosperms don't have flowers, flowering plants do, and the presence of fruit. No fruit for the gymnosperms, fruit for the flowering plants. All right. So gymnosperm, again, naked seeded. Gymnos means naked from Greek word, and you probably heard that particular word in, well, it's a root word for gymnasium, the working out place, right? In ancient Greece, they were working out literally naked, hence the name. So now the characteristics that changes, the seed is not enclosed in fruits, no fruits for the gymnosperms. That's the main thing. Even though, once again, it says naked seeded, and some of you will start answering, oh, naked seeded means they don't have the seed cover. They do. You can see it right here. That part, the outer part right here, that's a seed cover, which is protecting the embryo with the food source from drying out. But there is no fruit. So cone-bearing plants, mostly, they don't have the ovaries, and the ovary in the flowering plants essentially what will develop into the fruits. So anytime you're eating fruit, you're eating part of the ovary. Again, we are horrible to the plants. We eat all kinds of weird things. Well, from like, you're not will go and like, hey, today we'll have a chicken ovaries, right? No, or a cow ovaries, or what have you. No, we generally not going for those parts. But going and buy some of the avocados, hey, no problem, right? Well, avocados, the fleshy part of the avocados, it's ovaries, it's overgrowing ovaries, and then we're discarding the seed. In most of the cases, we're not going for the avocado seeds. We can get, well, we can press it and create the avocado oil out of the embryos once again. Now, ovules and seed develops on a very specialized leaves known as the sporophylls. We have several major groups known as the ginkgos, cycads, and conifers. In most of the cases, they are evergreens, even though ginkgos are not. Ginkgos are changing they have a leafy parts, well, leaves change the color from the green, they will turn into a yellow, and then they fall off during the fall season. I have a tiny little bitty ginkgo tree on my backyard. I bought it over the summer. I was in a random Kroger, and I was coming out and I saw a tiny little bitty ginkgo tree, and it was already on sale, and I'm like, I gotta have it. I'll plant it, and then we'll see if it will grow. Usually ginkgos can grow pretty tall, somewhere about 30, 40 feet tall. That one is still about 4 feet tall for now. So anyway, so here we still have the alternation of generations. Whatever you see is the sporophyte, the trees, the Christmas trees, or pine trees, the cypresses, etc. All of that are the sporophyte. Within the sporophyte, this is where the male and female cones will produce the spores. In the male cone, it will produce tiny little bitty spores. In a female cone, it will produce large spores, the microspores and megaspores. Megaspores will stay within the cone. The microspores will be sent through the air, gliding through the air, hopefully landing on the proper species of the proper, well, on the cone of the proper species, and then fertilizing the egg within the pine cone. And then as soon as fertilization occurs, we start talking about the diploid organism, and it will produce the egg, well, it will produce the zygote as well as the food source, and eventually it takes a couple of years for the full seed to be released, and then it has usually a wing to glide through the air and disperse that way. And then we'll start looking at the newly germinating seedlings. Over a few years, it will grow into a complete tree, okay? So once again, vascular plants with the seeds, but the seeds don't have the fruits. They totally exposed, just kind of hanging there, or they might be on the cones. And today, during the lab, not today, the next lab number 8, we'll see the representation of that. Now, 2 more terms, monoecious, dioecious. Mono means one, meaning the same plant carries the male and female reproductive organs, essentially hermaphrodite, but typically we're talking about hermaphrodites when we're discussing the animals. Maybe in the different parts of the tree, but it's a monoecious tree, meaning male and female reproductive organs on the same plant, not necessarily tree, but on the same plant. Now, dioecious, you have a male plant and you have a female plant, separate, okay? That plant also only produces the microspores, that plant producing megaspores, male, female, distinct individuals. If we would be a plants, and we are not, but if we would we be a monoecious or dioecious? Type it in, tell me what do you think. We are monoecious or dioecious from the plant characteristics. We're not plants, I know that, but dioecious. Jessica thinks that we are dioecious. Anybody else thinks anything else? Only Jessica paying attention? Oh, Jessica, I'm not saying that you are wrong. If we would be a plant, yes, you are absolutely correct. We are dioecious, but I was looking for a little bit more answers because only about half of the small class answered. The other half I can literally count absent right now during the lecture, right? Yeah, I would hate to. I can pull it out, a poll, a question right away. Are we dioecious, monoecious? And based on that particular poll, who answered within a minute or so, can be counted as the absence or presence in the class. So try not to be, not to do that. Pay a little bit of attention to that. So here we go. Anybody tried pine nuts before? Yummy by themselves. If you never tried pine nuts, you can say, well, I never did it. If you ever went to the Italian restaurant and ordered the pesto pasta. Pesto is a sauce predominantly made out of pine nuts, crushed up pine nuts, again, crushed out embryos. And now you can clearly see the food source. This is what we're going for. And this structure already looked like a tiny little bitty seedling. That's the embryo of the pine tree. And then, of course, it will have a cover, seed coat. Seed coat, the food source, and the embryo. This one, in order to show us, the cover has been removed. So coniferous trees are one of the largest organisms, or at least visible organism on the face of the earth. That's a sequoia redwoods in the Sequoia National Park in California, Northern California, about 2 hours, maybe a little bit more driving from San Francisco. If you'll ever be in that particular area, I would highly recommend it. It's a small park. You can kind of drive through within a day. I would recommend you to stay for a day or so. But those particular trees are humongous. I mean, you're not realizing how huge they are until you will get right next to that. That's a human being right there. There's several people right here. You can see right here. And that's the presidential sequoia, one of the largest trees we know of. Look how huge it is. So that's the human being right there. And there is the whole tree. Yeah. So presumably 6 feet or so, right? So that's 6 feet, another 6 feet. So yeah, those ones are hundreds of feet tall. huge. As a matter of fact, in that particular, and I need to find the, I keep telling that I need to find, and I'm not forgetting about that. But I need to find the picture in that particular park, the road going in, and the one lane road is actually going through one of the trees. You're literally driving through the trees. This is how huge in your car, well, in my car, I was driving through the sequoia, and it's still a live tree. Everything is fine, and you can drive through. Everything is cool. Anyway, so yeah, giant redwoods. That's one of the most common examples of that. So they still have wood. We'll talk about that, but wood is mostly xylem. Bark needles are essentially leaves, and the seeds are in cones. So coniferal pinophyta, the Christmas trees, pine, most of them monoecious. You will find the male and the female cones on the same tree. Comparatively to some others like ginkgos I was telling you about, and I still don't know if mine is a male or female, they are dioecious. I also in the front yard and in the backyard, I have something which is known as the sago palms. You most likely seen those. They are quite common in the Houston area. But sago palms are actually not palms. They are gymnosperms called Sagatophyta, and we'll talk about that. And they are they are dioecious as well. Both of my sago palms are males. They produce a huge cones which producing spores, well, the pollen essentially. So here we're looking at the pine tree, and those ones are male cones producing tons of pollen. As a matter of fact, hey, here we go. Look, this is the tree, right? A typical pine tree which has been cut down, and it will be falling down. Whenever it falls down, let me see if I will be able to. Hold on, first of all. Whenever it's falling down, here we go. Whenever it's falling down, it will release the pollen because of the process of falling down. So let's kind of take a look on that. How much pollen will be produced? All the yellow stuff which you will see is actual pollen. A cloud of it. See how huge that is? That's all microspores. All of the grains, tiny little bitty grains, contain the sperm which will be spreading all over the place. All right, so now in here, we're looking at again pine tree, but now we're looking at the larger cones known as the female cones, and this is a young female cone. That one is already growing, so this is this year cone. This one is probably 2 years old, and it's already releasing the seeds. It takes about 2 years, well, depending on the species, but on average, it takes about 2 years for the seeds to completely develop. So that one is already releasing the seeds. That one is just getting the seeds in. Well, so fertilization just occurring. So young female cone, mature female cone. So yeah. Here's another example of the tree, and that was a giant redwood sequoia tree, the cut off in 1800s. No, it was, it died, I think, in 1900s, and it's also, you can find it in the Yosemite National Park. In Yosemite National Park, near the ranger station or main ranger station, they have a restaurant and the shopping tiny little bitty shopping center. And then of course they have a small museum, quite interesting, free museum, by the way. And right in front of the entrance of the museum, I think the entrance is to the left. You can see the cross section of that particular tree, and it has something which is known as the year rings, right? Annual rings. And those particular annual rings, somebody with a lot of time kind of counted back, and you can see pretty much the whole history or written history of humanity within one tree. The tree lived through most of the history of, well, written history of the humans. Started somewhere around 200 or so AD. Then we have a 10,000 Battle of the Hastings. Then 1215 Magna Carta. It was the, anybody knows what Magna Carta is? Magna Carta was a government document, United States Constitution, well, in Great Britain, but United States Constitution a lot, well, took a lot of ideas from the Magna Carta. And then, of course, 1492 landing of Columbus, right here, so right here, landing of Columbus where? In the New World, West India, so to speak, because Columbus was thinking he's traveling around the world to get into the India, to the riches of the India, spices and all that old stuff. By the time Columbus already knew that Earth is around and he was traveling, he just didn't know there is like 2 continents on the way. So whenever he hit, he thought he got into the India, west part of the India, and therefore the Native Americans, they called Indians, right? And then, of course, we're talking about landing of the Pilgrims, with then we already discussed the Thanksgiving, due to tiny little bitty fungi known as the East, and then, of course, Declaration of the Independence, 1776, and the Civil War, and I think it was cut down, well, it fell off in early 1900s. So as you can see, those trees can live literally for thousands of years. All right, here's another one, less known, ginkgos. I already talked about the ginkgos, and this is how the ginkgo tree looks during the fall or winter, and this is the ginkgo tree within the, well, during the spring and the summertime. Very, very interesting group. The whole phylum contains right now only 1 species, known as the Ginkgo biloba, because the leaves are very, very characteristic, and they called, well, they commonly referred to as the dog food shaped leaves, 2 parts of it. A very interesting group because it's something which is known as the living fossils. At some point of time, roughly 100 or so millions of years ago, ginkgos were everywhere. Now we can find natively in the Southeast Asia, well, I should say East Asia, Korea, Japan, and down south. And those particular trees right now are being brought to United States. Like I told you, I got the one from the Kroger, not advertising it. So east part of Asia, and then in United States, they are quite commonly because they very, very harsh for the, well, they can live in a harsh air pollution areas. So in the cities, they are quite commonly strive. As a matter of fact, it's one of the, let me kind of go about the environmental insult. So this is how the leaf look like, as you can see. And this is, of course, the seeds of that, and they are dioecious. The female ginkgo will produce seeds, and seeds can be used for food. Those particular structure, it's not the fruit of the ginkgo, but those ones are the soft part of the seed. And whenever the female produces those seeds, whenever they fell off or fell down on the tree or on the ground, they produce a really, really bad smell. That's one of the reasons if we are planting them, we usually don't plant females, because the seeds producing, not the seeds themselves, but whenever they fall on the ground, they produce really bad smell. Most of the people referring as the smell, which is a mixture of dog vomit with the dog feces. So yeah, not a very pretty smell whatsoever. However, those ones are quite commonly used in the Pacific Northeast. You can find them living, like Seattle has quite a few of those particular trees, mostly males once again. And speaking of the environmental insults, As you know, in 1945, United States dropped 2 bombs, nuclear bombs, on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, not too far from the epicenter, a couple of about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from the epicenter, there was a park which was made out of ginkgo trees, and of course the blast obliterated everything. And while the Japanese people were repairing, rebuilding everything, a couple of years later down, they saw that some of the trees from that particular park, which has been nuclear bombed, right, start growing new trees, new branches, etc. And they call them a park of the nuclear ginkgos, because that's the creatures which literally withstand the nuclear blast, withstand, continue to grow. And of course, the Japanese were doing some research, checking if there is any major mutations happen. No, not really. A couple of years ago, several of those seedlings from the nuclear ginkgos has been given to United States as a symbol of peace. So talking about the environmental impact and the harsh environmental conditions. Yeah, a tree can withstand the, well, maybe not a direct nuclear impact, but they were pretty close. Everything else died, they survived. And this is how the trees are, well, the leaves are looking around. As you can see, dark leaves. And what's really interesting that those leaves, once again, we can trace it down. We can trace it down to some of the several million of year old trees. First of all, a very characteristic shape, and then the venation going as the fan. And this is the picture of one of the ginkgo trees in, I think it's in Seattle, could be Portland. So one or another, it's in the park right there, ginkgo trees. And I'm like, look, honey, ginkgo trees. She's like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, she's not very excited about biology. And I'm not too excited about botany, but some of those things, whenever you first see, like, wow, that's cool. Anyway, and you will see in the lab that we have the fossilized leaf or imprint of the leaf, so which makes those creatures living fossils, right? So cicada phyta or sago palms, they look like palms, but they're not closely related to the palms. And again, they have those compound leaves known as the fronds. And in those ones also have a males and females. And I think there is a picture, yeah, looks like palm. So here what we're looking at, the top part of the palm tree right on top of that particular sago palm, also referred to as a cycad. It will have a cone-looking structure. If you'll start, it has a tiny little bitty leafy parts, which is protecting the orange, relatively large seeds. And this is the seeds, actual seeds. So that's a female cone. Male cone, on the other hand, will be kind of elongated. Will have tons of, it will be relatively large, about 20 or so inches long, and it will produce a lot of pollen. Like I said, I have 2 of those in my front yard and in the backyard, and both of them are males. So every spring, well, except the last year, because of the freeze, they were kind of coming out from the freeze. But every year they will produce those particular cones, and then I'm cutting the cone and I'm bringing it to the lab. Here are some of the cycad, which is again look like a palm tree. That's in Florida, and that would be the male cone right here. So we're looking at the male cycad. And then there is a really interesting group known as the gnetophytes. You might have heard about the ephedra, might not, I don't know. It was quite a few years ago when the extract of the ephedra was used in energy drinks. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But they are very interesting among the gymnosperms because they start looking like the flowering plants. They don't really have flowers yet, but they have clusters of the sporangia which start resembling flowers. They also start looking, especially like ephedra. It has a seed and there will be a soft tissue around the seed. So it's called ephedra berries, even though it's not technically berry, because they don't have fruits per se, but it starts looking very similar to the flowering plant. So the genetics support that particular claim that gnetophytes and the angiosperms are closest related plants, and you can see some of those particular things. So here we're looking at the clusters, look like a tiny little bitty flowers. And now this is the ephedra with the seeds. It's not the berries, even though commonly you can find the ephedra in dry areas like, well, dry states. In Arizona, you can go and find it literally growing wild. And those seeds contain a chemical known as ephedrine. Ephedrine, similar to a caffeine, is a really good speeding up, well, in speeding up the heart. So at some point of time, a company were using that one, ephedrine, to produce the energy drinks, and it was really, really, I mean, it's really potent. And of course, as all the energy drinks, they will say you should not be drinking more than 2 or 1 a day or something like that. And of course, consumers don't really reading those particular things, so they prefer to ignore. But ephedrine is much more potent than caffeine, for example, itself. And therefore, quite a few people from over drinking those particular things got heart attacks. And then FDA step in and says that ephedrine is a really bad chemical because people start abusing it, and you might end up with a heart attack. So yeah, I tried those berries. Well, back home where I'm coming from, those ephedra, you can find it in the kind of arid areas, desert places, and I traveled a lot. So you can eat a couple of them, no problem whatsoever. Your heart will not explode or anything like that. They are semi-sweet, and yes, you are feeling that particular jolt of energy after chewing on several of them during the day. But yeah, once again, the dosage is what makes it very, very dangerous, or could be dangerous. Now we're looking at the Welwitschia. Welwitschia is a very curious plant, and you can see it right here, right there, all of those particular plants. They live in extremely hot deserts. That one is from the Namib desert. It's actually 2 leaves only, and then it intertwines and it survives in super hot deserts, usually not too far from the coastline. As a result, it gets the water from the evaporation or condensation as morning dew, so to speak. And then, of course, we have gnetum per se, and you can start seeing that the little cones now start resembling fruits of a very simple flowering plants such as magnolias. And we have magnolias quite commonly here. Soon they will start producing those cone-like structures with the seeds in them. And this is what linking those particular group with the flowering plant. I'm almost done with the lecture, so bear with me a little bit more. So here we have the ancestral algae. Remember, green algae, right? Charophytans give us liverworts as well as the mosses. And all of those considered to be a non-vascular plants. And then we ended up with the forming the vasculature. The plants come up with the transporting system, and we ended up with seedless ferns and such. And then we ended up with the seeds. And from the seeds, again, dichotomous. So we're looking at the derivative traits, gymnosperms, and finally angiosperms, right? This is the most common plants on the face of the earth right now. Totally about 300,000 species of all the plants, 250,000 of them are angiosperms. We live in the era of mammals as well as the angiosperms. So really quickly, haploid single set of the chromosomes found only in the sperm and the egg, as well as the spore and the gametophytes. Now diploid double set of chromosomes, zygote, seeds, and the sporophyte. Dryland adaptations. First, obtaining the adequate supply of water. So you have to have roots getting into penetrating the soil and start pumping the water out. As a result, you have to have a transporting system. So developing of the true roots to conduct the water to the upper parts of the plant, extremely important. Now, physical support. Unlike in water, we have a, well, here we have in water, you have a gravity, but now the gravity in the water is also counteracted with the buoyancy force. There is much less buoyancy force in the air. As a result, the plant, in order to grow up, have to go against the gravitational pull of the whole planet. So physical support. As a matter of fact, plants, what they did, they took that particular conductive tissue, xylem, and made it into physical support. So conductive tissues. Now, sperm to egg without the water. Remember, we were talking about this, and that was a very important step in the dryland adaptations. And they come up with the wind blowing pollen. And later on, now you know that some of the plants, flowering plants, employ animals like bees to carry the pollen grains from one flower to another. And then, of course, pollen tube to carry the sperm directly to the egg. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, protective structure for the zygote. Therefore, plants are coming up with the what? With the seed, the cover, the food source, and the embryo. Developing a seed to protect and nourish the embryo. And then less available carbon dioxide. Why? Why there was a less available carbon dioxide between, let's say, 300 millions of years ago and now? Because remember those particular ferns, the tree start growing, then dying off, well, building up the, taking the carbon dioxide, building the cell walls out of cellulose, then dying off, getting buried. As a result, the carbon stayed in the ground, forming the coal deposit, exactly the same coal deposits which we are digging out, and now we are releasing that stored carbon in the form of the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. As a result, the concentration of the carbon dioxide slowly creeping up. And this is why some of the scientists saying, we're gonna die, we're gonna burn. Let's say about 30 years ago, everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of scientists were convinced whenever we will hit about 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, usually it's within 100, 120 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Somebody said, well, the estimations were we're hitting 400 parts per million, and that will trigger the global warming, everybody gonna die. And about 20 years ago, we hit 400 parts per million and we're still okay. So the scientists changed the narrative and say, no, we were slightly incorrect, 600 parts per million. This is when the planet going to burn. In 2014 or 2015 in the summer, was very exciting because at that particular time we reached in atmosphere, we reached 600 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and we're still here. So now the narrative changed again and saying for the global warming, for the planet to die, we're supposed to reach about, well, some of them saying 1,000 and others saying 1,500 parts per million. Well, we'll see. We're slowly creeping up toward that. So yeah. As a result, they develop, well, less available carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide have to go in and oxygen have to go out through a specific openings through the leaves known as the stomata, and we'll discuss that later on next week. And have to withstand a wide range of temperature because now the plants can be found all the way from the Arctic all the way to the equator, with very, very different temperatures, very different humidities, and so on. So what they did is they come up with a waxy cuticle. Again, what a waxy cuticle is. Same thing as we have a cuticle, right? Skin, the top part of the skin, which prevents from what? From dehydration or desiccation. We discussed that before. And then on the angiosperms, we continue next time. So again, I kind of split that particular seeded plants into two parts. So we're done with the lecture for today. As usual, I'm giving you about 5 minutes to get your lab ready and we'll go into the lab, all right? So let's see. A lot of open. So where's the Zoom? Here we go. All right, let's stop recording to begin with.